Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Schaefer, and as promised, here's a little recorded lecture for what we would have done together in class on Monday the 20th. I wanted to get this to you so you had the weekend also, in case I know people are working and have busy lives, and that could give you a little bit of extra time. So I'll give you the lecture and then I'll explain the activity. And then you can bring that with you to our first meeting on the 27th of January. And I'll put all of this in the email so you know exactly what to do. So this was the copy of the kind of schedule that we're going to be following. And the work we're doing is on the left side. And if you look at the highlighted portion, the topic that we're looking at today is using text structure to identify important concepts, textbook headings, table of contents, chapter summaries, and other features. And so, this is review, I'm sure, for most people, but what I want you to think about, I want you to think about the things we do together in class in 3 ways, which might help to kind of freshen up the approach to this class. So you're going to think about it first for yourself as a learner. As we go through this, what does this mean for you personally as you're learning Ed Psych and preparing for your quizzes and exams? And then I want you to think about the things we do, making connections between what you're doing in the activities I give you and what you're reading about. Do you see connections between the strategies and the things that you're learning in Ed Psych? And thirdly, I want you to start to think about if you were teaching or when you're teaching, what these strategies, how you might want to use these strategies with your students too, because obviously you're going to have to modify them based on the age of your students and the context of the teaching. So if you think about it in those 3 ways, even though you've probably done most of these things before, you should be able to look at them through kind of new glasses, and I hope that that's helpful. So this week's all about, and really everything that we do is about noticing what's important in the textbook, because in college you already know a lot of the learning you have to do, you do independently. Dr. Zubak's going to present some material in class, and you're going to do some discussion and you're going to do some activities, but frankly a lot of the learning, the hard work of learning, of identifying what's important, of remembering it, of being able to use it, is something that you're going to do on your own and that you're going to have to get your students to do on their own as well. So first you're going to be noticing what's important. Eventually we're going to talk about remembering what's important. And finally, and most importantly, once those 2 things are done, being able to use what's important from the textbook. So let's get started. I made a scan of chapter 2, which is what you'll be working on in class next week. So while the quality of this isn't super, you should have your book. So follow along in your actual book if you can. And so along the way, we're noticing what's important. The textbooks go to a lot of trouble to design themselves so that the things that are important stand out, that you don't have to go hunting and fishing to say, well, what's important? What do I need to know? They spend a lot of time in their design to make that obvious. So if we go to the first page of chapter 2, you'll notice at the beginning of every chapter there's a chapter outline. So right there you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subtopics for chapter 2, which is about cognitive, language, and literacy development. And there are those 5 main subtopics that are going to be part of this chapter. So if you take a minute to look at those, how did children develop cognitively? How did Piaget view cognitive development? How is Piaget's work viewed today? How did Vygotsky view cognitive development? And how do language and literacy develop? These are big questions, big topics, and they're all the things you're going to have to know by the time you're done reading. So we're just noticing right now. We're not really doing any deep reading, but you want to look at that, and you'll see you're setting your brain up to give this information that's going to come later a place to connect, right? So now maybe you've never heard of Piaget. Maybe you've never heard of Vygotsky before. Maybe you're saying, I don't know how language and literacy develop. Maybe you've got some questions already, and that's good. And so we start out very gently scanning the chapter, getting your brain ready to be able to receive more complicated information. So we spend some time just looking at that chapter outline and the title. We move on to the learning outcomes of the chapter. And this should be somewhat of a repeat in a different way of the outline. So now we say, okay, the learning outcomes for this chapter. By the end of the chapter, you should be able to describe Vygotskian and Piagetian theories of human development. So humans develop. These two researchers have different theories about how that happens. Identify ways you can set up your classroom and promote literacy development in young children. So they're already applying these theories and getting you to think about what your classroom might look and feel like. And then identify the stages of language and literacy development during the elementary and middle school years. So now they're going to be talking about the early school development for elementary and middle school years. So we already know Vygotsky, we know Piaget, we know you're going to be learning about the stages of language and literacy development, and we really haven't done a lot of reading yet. So the next thing I want you to do, surprisingly, I don't want you to jump right in, I want you to go actually to the very end of the chapter now. So now we're going to skip ahead until you get to, and each chapter has these, the chapter summary. And I'll tell you why. They've done the hard work of summarizing what are the important ideas, the big ideas you're going to be encountering when you read the chapter. And if you can understand the ideas here, it will help you when you go back to read for the details. So you want to take a minute now, and you can pause the recording to spend some time with the summary to read these three. How do children develop cognitively? How did Piaget view cognitive development? How is Piaget's work viewed today? And then go on to the next page at the top. How did Vygotsky view cognitive development? How do language and literacy develop during the preschool years and then during the elementary and secondary years? So you should read those first, and then what I suggest you do in your notebook is they've summarized it for you. I'd like you to try and write that in your own words, right? So it doesn't do you any good to just copy word for word. You need to read it enough so that you understand it, so that you feel like you could explain it either to yourself, to your mom, to somebody who doesn't know educational psychology. How could you say it in your own words? Once you can do that, then you've got a good handle on what you've just read. So take a little break. I want you to take some time, try and read these and get it into your own words, and then we'll come back and continue with the chapter. Okay, so you've looked at the chapter summary, and now we're going to go back, and you're ready. You've got the 6 big pieces that you need to think about in this chapter, and now you're going to go back, and what else do you notice, right? So we're just trying to say what's important about this chapter. So the other structures of the text that can help you do that are the big headings, right? So notice in the very first section, how do children develop cognitively, right? So you may need to look up the word cognitive. Don't go any further. If you don't know what that word means, this is a good time to go look it up. So how do they develop in their minds and with their ability to think? Notice the subheadings, right? So how do children develop their ability to think cognitively? Aspects of development, issues of development. We look at these subheadings, and then there are even subheadings: nature versus nurture, continuous and discontinuous theories. And then you notice bolded words here, which are already jumping off the page to show you, hey, this is important, this is important. And now notice on the left-hand side some some nice definitions for some of those bolded words. But you must know, though, that it's not enough at this stage of the game to just come down through here very quickly and write down the definitions of these words and their definitions. You will miss much of what's important and complex about the ideas that you're going to be reading about. So, but it doesn't hurt to go through and just take a first pass and look through, just kind of skim through here and say, okay, you could read those definitions on the side once. Maybe they aren't going to make a lot of sense yet, but at least you've started to process in your brain what those words may mean. And so at that point, I would say you should do that for every chunk of the textbook. So I'm not going to do that for the whole book, right? Because it would be too much to come back. You would have forgotten it already. So I would scan this first chunk, right? You've got some definitions, you've got some headings and subheadings. And now I'm going to stop and I'm going to read this part more in depth. So I'm going to want to make sure I have a quiet room. I want to be able to really focus. I want to have a pen and paper at hand, and I'm going to use these headings and subheadings and bolded words and subheadings to create an outline of what's most important in this chapter. And so as you're reading chapter 2, what I'd like you to do is create an outline that has the headings, the subheadings, the important vocabulary and definitions of those vocabulary, right? But so now you're going to go back and you're going to read just that first section in great detail until you understand it. That may mean that you need to pull out examples. So when you read the definition of continuous theories of development, maybe that makes sense right away, but maybe you need some definitions, right? So generally, as you're looking through the textbook, they'll define something and they'll give you some examples. And that helps you to fill out that definition, understand it more deeply. So as you do your outline, there's your definition. Give an example, one that's enough so that, say, 2 weeks from now when you're getting ready to study for your exam, or 14 weeks from now when you're getting ready for your comprehensive exam, you have something to fall back on that helps you remember in a more deep way what those terms mean. Okay? So you're going to do that section by section, an outline with the most important sections, ideas, words, and examples. You want to notice also anytime they stop to put illustrations, those are super important because they're taking the time to illustrate, to show you through pictures and diagrams the most important ideas in the chapter. So, for example, these stages of cognitive development for Piaget, you're going to need those. Now, for your teacher's exams, you're just going to always need to know this. And so they take the time in these kind of diagrams and pictures and charts to organize the information for you so you don't have to think about what's the best way to organize this. They've done it already, right? So there are 4 stages: sensory motor, right? What's the age for that? What are the major accomplishments? The first time reading that, I think, well, gosh, formation of concept of object permanence and gradual progression from reflexive behavior to goal-directed behavior. What does that mean, right? So until you can restate that in your own words for what does that mean and give some examples, you really won't understand that stage yet. And that's, as you read this more deeply, you should be going back and forth to these charts and filling in your own words that help you remember, little triggers that help you remember, well, what does that stage really mean? And the pictures as you go through here and the illustrations are really important. So you want to spend the time to look at those, understand what those mean, and how do they relate back to those stages, right? They can be really, really helpful. So your job is to make a good outline for yourself, something that would serve as a great study guide for your exam and for the comprehensive exam. All right, good luck.